Barbra Streisand was telling a story. Jimmy said a name, and decades of professional armor vanished in seconds. The Tonight Show. Studios 6A at Rockefeller Center. March 2024. The kind of night that happens maybe twice a year, when a genuine legend sits in the guest chair. Not just a celebrity. Not just a star. A legend. Barbra Streisand, the voice that defined generations, the EGOT winner, the woman who had commanded stages and screens for over 60 years. She was on the show promoting her latest memoir. The interview had been going perfectly. Jimmy was his usual enthusiastic self, asking questions with genuine reverence. Barbra was relaxed, charming, telling stories from her incredible career with the practiced ease of someone who'd done 10,000 interviews. The audience was loving it. The Roots were playing soft background music between segments. Everything was exactly as it should be on a successful late-night talk show. Jimmy leaned forward, consulting his blue cue cards. So in the book, you talk about your early days in New York. The struggling years. Before Broadway. Before anyone knew who I was. Barbra finished with a slight smile. Yes. Those years were difficult but important. I was 19, 20 years old. Living in a tiny apartment. Going to auditions. Getting rejected constantly. But you kept going. I kept going because I had people who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, Barbra said. Her voice had that quality, warm, nostalgic, but still controlled. Still the professional performer who had mastered every interview technique decades ago. There was a vocal coach. A woman who let me take lessons even though I couldn't afford to pay her. She'd say you have something special, don't let them break you. Jimmy nodded, genuinely moved. That's beautiful. What was her name? Barbra opened her mouth to answer. And then something happened that no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, expected. Her face changed. Not gradually. Instantly. Like someone had reached inside and switched off every protective mechanism she'd built over 6 decades in show business. Her name. Barbra's voice cracked. Her hand flew to her throat. Her name was... She couldn't finish the sentence. Jimmy stopped mid-smile. The entire studio froze. The audience sensed something was wrong immediately. The relaxed energy of a successful interview evaporated. Questlove glanced at the other band members uncertainly. The cameras stayed locked on Barbra's face, capturing every detail as one of the most composed performers in entertainment history struggled to speak. Jimmy's smile faded completely. He leaned forward, concern replacing his host's persona. Barbra? Are you okay? Barbra shook her head slightly, her hand still at her throat, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. I haven't said her name out loud in I don't know how long. Jimmy put down his cue cards. The blue cards that guided every interview, that kept the show on schedule, that ensured everything ran smoothly. He set them aside and gave Barbra his complete attention. We can take a break if you need to, he said quietly. No. Barbra's voice was firmer now, though still shaking. No, I need to. I want to talk about her. I should talk about her. Ruth. Her name was Ruth Edelstein. The name hung in the air. Simple. Ordinary. And clearly carrying weight that no one in the studio had anticipated. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1961. Barbra Streisand wasn't always Barbra Streisand, the legend. In 1961, she was Barbara Joan Streisand, a 19-year-old girl from Brooklyn with an unusual voice and impossible dreams. She'd moved to Manhattan against her mother's wishes, convinced she could make it as a singer despite everyone telling her she wasn't pretty enough, wasn't conventional enough, didn't have the right look. She was broke. Constantly. Living in a 4th-floor walk-up apartment so small she could touch both walls while lying in bed. She ate 1 meal a day. She wore the same 3 outfits in rotation. She went to every audition she could find and heard, no, more times than she could count. "You're talented," casting directors would say, "but you're not what we're looking for." What they meant was, "You're not beautiful in the way we want. Your nose is too big. Your look is too ethnic. You're too Brooklyn. Too Jewish. Too different." Barbara heard it so many times she started to believe it. Started to think maybe her mother was right. Maybe she should go back to Brooklyn. Get a normal job. Forget about singing. She was seriously considering giving up when she met Ruth Edelstein. Ruth was a vocal coach who taught out of a small studio in the West Village. 63 years old. European accent that Barbara later learned was German-Jewish. Ruth had escaped Nazi Germany in 1938, had rebuilt her life in New York, had spent the last 20 years teaching voice to aspiring singers who could afford her rates. Barbara couldn't afford her rates. Couldn't afford even a fraction of what Ruth charged. But she'd heard through a friend of a friend that Ruth sometimes took on students for reduced fees if they showed real promise. Barbara gathered her courage and showed up at Ruth's studio unannounced. A tiny room with a piano, walls covered in fading photographs of students who'd gone on to have careers. Ruth was working with another student when Barbara arrived, but she agreed to listen after the lesson finished. "Sing something," Ruth said in her accented English, sitting at the piano. "Something that means something to you." Barbara sang. She poured everything into it, all the frustration, all the fear, all the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would finally see what she saw in herself. When she finished, Ruth was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "You have something I have not heard in 20 years of teaching. Something extraordinary. But you don't believe it yet." "I can't afford," Barbara started. "I don't care about money," Ruth interrupted. "I care about talent. Real talent. The kind that comes along maybe once in a generation. You will study with me. We will work together. And you will not pay me until you are successful." Barbara's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do that?" Ruth smiled sadly. "Because someone did it for me once. In Berlin. Before everything changed. A teacher who saw something in a scared Jewish girl and taught her for free because he believed in her. I never got to repay him. He died in the camps. So I repay him by doing the same for you." For the next 2 years, Barbara studied with Ruth twice a week. Ruth taught her technique, yes. But more than that, she taught her confidence. She taught her that being different wasn't a flaw. It was her strength. "They tell you your nose is too big," Ruth would say. "Good. That means they will remember you. They tell you that you don't look like everyone else. Excellent. Who wants to look like everyone else? You are unique. Own it." Ruth came to Barbara's early performances in tiny clubs and coffee houses. She sat in the back, always in the same seat, always with the same encouraging smile. When Barbara bombed, Ruth would say, "You're learning." When Barbara succeeded, Ruth would say, "You're becoming." In 1963, Barbara got her breakthrough role in the Broadway musical, "I Can Get It For You Wholesale." Ruth came to opening night. Barbara looked out from the stage during curtain call and saw her teacher in the audience, tears streaming down her face, applauding harder than anyone. After the show, Ruth came backstage. She hugged Barbara and whispered, "My work is done. You don't need me anymore. You never really did. You just needed to believe it yourself." "What do you mean?" Barbara asked, suddenly frightened. "Of course I still need you. We have a lesson scheduled for Thursday." Ruth smiled that sad smile again. "No, darling. You're going to be a star now. Real lessons are over. You've outgrown me. I could never outgrow you." Barbara protested. "You already have," Ruth said gently. "And that's exactly what I wanted." Barbara didn't understand. She tried to schedule another lesson. Ruth kept postponing, making excuses. Finally, Ruth's landlord told Barbara that Ruth had moved. No forwarding address. Just gone. Barbara was devastated, but her career was exploding. Funny Girl, on Broadway. The movie. Record deals. Her life became a whirlwind of success, and she told herself she'd find Ruth eventually. She'd track her down and repay everything she owed. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Years passed. Decades. Barbra became exactly what Ruth predicted. A legend. But she never found Ruth Edelstein. It was like her teacher had vanished completely. No phone listing. No studio. Nothing. Barbra tried hiring private investigators in the 1970s. Nothing. She mentioned Ruth's name to other musicians who'd been in New York in the early 60s. No one remembered her. It was like Ruth had been a ghost. A guardian angel who appeared exactly when needed and disappeared when her work was done. But Barbra never forgot. In every major performance, in every big moment of her career, she thought about that small studio in the West Village. About Ruth's accented voice saying, "You have something extraordinary." About the teacher who believed in her when no one else did. She just never talked about it publicly. It was too personal. Too painful. How do you explain someone who saved your life and then disappeared? How do you talk about a debt you can never repay because you can't find the person you owe? For 60 years, Barbra Streisand carried Ruth Edelstein's name in her heart and never said it out loud. Until tonight. When Jimmy Fallon asked a simple question about her early days and suddenly all those decades of silence became unbearable. Behind the scenes, Jimmy made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. The studio was still silent. Barbra was crying now, not trying to hide it. Tears streaming down her face. Barbra Streisand, who had commanded stages in front of thousands, who had performed for presidents and royalty, was crying on late-night television because she'd spoken a name she'd kept locked away for 6 decades. Jimmy did something he'd never done before in 15 years of hosting. He stood up from his desk, walked around it, and sat down on the front edge, right next to where Barbra sat in the guest chair. Not hovering over her. Not performing for the cameras. Just sitting close, present, human. "Tell me about her," he said softly. "Tell me about Ruth." The control room erupted. Producers were screaming into headsets. "What is he doing? We're on schedule. We have another segment. The commercial break is in 3 minutes." But director Dave Diamadi, watching the monitors, held up his hand. "Let it play," he said quietly. "Keep rolling." Barbra looked at Jimmy through her tears. At this man young enough to be her grandson, who had just set aside every rule of television to give her space to grieve. "She saved my life," Barbra said, her voice raw. "I was going to give up. Go back to Brooklyn. Forget about singing. And she just appeared. Like an angel. She taught me for 2 years and wouldn't take money. She said someone had done it for her once. In Berlin. Before the war." Jimmy's eyes were glistening now. "And then she disappeared?" "After my first Broadway show. She said her work was done. I tried to find her. For years I tried. I wanted to repay her. I wanted to tell her she was right. That I made it. But I never found her. Maybe," Jimmy said gently, "she knew. Maybe she was watching all along." Barbra nodded, wiping her eyes. "I hope so. I hope she knew that every time I stood on a stage, every time I sang, I was honoring what she gave me. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming." Jimmy reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, not his cue cards, something else entirely, and held it in his hands for a moment before speaking. "Barbra," he said quietly, "our producers did some research this week. We found something." He unfolded the paper carefully. "Ruth Edelstein died in 1982. She was 84 years old. She left her entire estate, which wasn't much, to a scholarship fund. For young singers who couldn't afford lessons." Barbra's hand flew to her mouth. "The fund is still active," Jimmy continued, his voice breaking. It's helped over 300 students in the last 40 years. And it's called... He looked at the paper. The Barbara Joan Scholarship. She named it after you. After the girl from Brooklyn who became everything she knew you could be. Barbara sobbed. Jimmy handed her the paper with trembling hands. She read it through tears, her fingers tracing Ruth's signature at the bottom of the original scholarship document. The studio erupted in applause. Not the performative TV applause. Real, cathartic, thunderous applause. The roots stood. The audience stood. Everyone understanding they'd witnessed something sacred. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show, Barbara donated $1 million to Ruth's scholarship fund. Jimmy matched it. The fund now helps over 100 students every year. And every one of them learns Ruth Edelstein's name, the teacher who believed, who disappeared, and who never stopped giving.